Hi, good morning, everybody. It's great to have you join us, or a good day wherever you are in the world. We are excited to have you join us today as we dig into a panel conversation talking about the building of a new identity standard. There was a lot of work that went into the creation of IDQL and Hexa. And what's great is we have this panel of working group members joining us today to talk about what happened behind the scenes and what was the need for creating IDQL and Hexa, and giving you a little bit of insight into what it takes to create that new standard. A few items of housekeeping that I'd like to take care of first are the fact that all of our attendees, so that's all of you in the audience, are going to be muted right now, and so don't worry about that. Second, we would like for you to ask questions at any time. You'll see a button on your screen to submit those questions. In the interest of time, we have so much to cover today that we're actually not going to do a live Q&A at the end, but we will be following up with an email with responses to all of your questions. So please do feel free to submit those throughout our conversation. We'll have some resources available at the end of this conversation to help point you in the direction of how do you get started with IDQL and Hexa. And finally, there will be a follow-up email for everybody with a recording of today's webinar. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself. I'll be your host today, Mark Callahan. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing at Strata Identity. And as we look ahead to the panelists that are joining us in this conversation, I am joined by Eric Olden, who's the CEO and co-founder of Strata Identity. We have Jerry Gable, who is the head of standards at Strata Identity. Bob Blakely is here with us as an operating partner from Team 8. Neil Danilowitz, who is a principal architect at Versa, an MEF member and editor. Mike Baronet, who's the lead developer and co-founder of Initial Capacity. And last but certainly not least, we have Tom Malta, who is a global leader in the IAM space. So thank you all for joining us. You've all been very involved with the working group to date, and excited to hear a little bit about your perspective. And in thinking about perspective, I'd like to actually lead off with a little bit of a lay of the land. Jerry, would you give us a little bit of background on where we are in terms of this multi-cloud world?
Sure thing, Mark. Yeah, so let's set a bit of context before we get into the rest of the program and the panel discussion here. So I think it's pretty well understood these days that most organizations are dealing with a multi-cloud challenge. That is, when we talk to customers, they have some combination of Google and Microsoft and Amazon, maybe Okta or some others as well. And of course, within each of these systems and platforms, policies are configured differently. It's all proprietary for each of those systems. And then that's further compounded when you think of the north-south axis. So it's not just about the applications, but the network, the data layer, and the platform itself. So in each of those technology areas, you have, again, another array of different policies and different techniques for managing access. And then, of course, we still have a fair amount on the legacy that's still on premises and hasn't fully migrated to the cloud. So it's a very complex and fragmented environment that we're dealing with. And that's where IDQL comes in to be the policy model or format that can be used to orchestrate this very disparate and varied environment. So IDQL is a universal policy format, a declarative policy format, and it works with the Hexa open source policy orchestration system. So this is a reference implementation that brings IDQL to life, or makes it operational. And the Hexa open source has three main functions. It's built on a provider framework, and we can have providers that connect to these different systems to first do a discovery. So when I connect to that platform or that environment, I can see what resources and what policies are already defined, pull them in, and then translate to IDQL. So I can do that for any number of target systems that I'm configured for. And now I can manage all of that access policy in IDQL. I just need to know one format. I can make my changes, make my modifications, and send it back out through the translation step, and then use orchestration to push those native policy settings back out to those target environments. So that's what IDQL and Hexa are all about, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So Mark, I think with that brief intro, I'll turn it back over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And that is exactly why we're here today, to have this conversation. You know, it's one of the questions that came up first and foremost from everyone that we've talked to about IDQL and Hexa is, why do we need another standard, and what's the need? And so with that, I'm just going to lead with that very same question. Eric, tell us a little bit about why we needed a new identity standard.
Yeah, great question. And, you know, I think what really, as Jerry alluded to, multi-cloud and distributed architectures came on to the market really quickly. And, you know, a lot of it brought new challenges and problems where you had a lot of this fragmentation. Things didn't work together. It was very difficult to find a way to make things consistent and manageable. And really, how do we make the clouds interoperable from a security and identity and access standpoint? And so, you know, we looked at the ways to solve that using the existing standards, and a number of the standards that have been really helpful and foundational to get identity to the cloud today are still going to be around, right? IDQL doesn't replace them, but it fills a gap that hadn't been met before, specifically around policy. So we have things like SAML, which has been really foundational to introduce this notion of distributed trust, and things like single sign-on and being able to share context between organizations and applications and sessions. And then we had things like OAuth and XAML, which were great for authorization in terms of runtime and how do we allow or deny different things to happen. But nothing had been done so far when it comes to the rules or the policies. And if you look at the commonality between all these systems, they all had policies, but all of the policies were proprietary, understandably, because they weren't ever designed to be interoperable. And so we looked at, hey, if we're going to solve the interoperability problem, why don't we start with the policies and look to build a standard so it's not just some company's product, but like other standards, really expand the openness of economy or of the market and so forth. So that was really the spark that lit the effort here at Strata to create this ecosystem and to, you know, build all of the working group and to produce what we've built so far. Anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, Bob, is there anything that you were going to add? You had thoughts about that. I definitely wanted to get your perspective as well, Bob, as we're thinking about, well, why did we need a new standard?
Sure. So when I think about this, I think back to the early days of user provisioning in the enterprise, right? And the reason you needed user provisioning was because you had a bunch of different systems, each of which had a notion of identity and each of which had a notion of access control. And and you had a small group of administrators who needed to be able to create all of those policies and who needed them to be consistent, because you had the same users being managed in all those systems and you were trying to give them the same set of permissions to a set of resources across the business. And so what happened in that instance was a bunch of different companies, Waveset, Sun, Oracle, SailPoint, all did the same thing. They all built a universe of connectors to all of the back-end systems. And they then put a single user interface on top of all of those connectors in order to create a comprehensible environment for administrators. Well, that was fine as long as you were going to be an Oracle customer, or you were going to be a SailPoint customer, or you were going to be a Waveset customer, or what have you. But it was enormously duplicative of effort because everybody was providing connectors. And also it locked you into a particular vendor's administrative framework. So what IDQL is really designed for is to provide one set of connectors via an open source project and allow everybody who's trying to create administrative function for enterprise, for multi-cloud environments in their tool set, to write to the homogeneous interface of IDQL and create a great experience for administering things coherently and consistently across all these platforms. And so fundamentally, that's the way I think about it, right? IDQL is a framework layer in between the backend systems in the cloud providers that are doing the implementation of identity management and the set of tools on top that are presenting identity management to the users. And this allows different set of tool sets to coexist and still to have identical results across all cloud environments and across, policy administration in general.
Gotcha. And what I love it, so you and Eric and Jerry, there's several of you. Eric, you were even a co-author of SAML. There's a lot of experience that went into building the standard, across the board on this panel. Where did we even think about starting building IDQL and Hexa? What did the process look like for creating the standard, Eric?
Yeah. Well, I think we looked at a couple of things in terms of like, how do you go from zero to a standard? And, I was one of the early people with SAML, along with Bob and Jerry, a lot of other people that, really created something out of nothing in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, so there's a lot of experience that we had to pull from to say, hey, what worked and what could we do differently and make it better? But the order of operations, the sequence that we took was to initially start with a conceptual framework where we were trying to figure out and find the scope of the problem. And importantly, put boundaries around that scope so it wasn't unbounded and something that would be maybe theoretically ideal, but practically impossible. So once we had this conceptual framework, we started to do a lot of customer development, talking to as many people as we could to say, hey, have you seen this problem before? What is it about the problem that you would like to prioritize, and get the input from the market and really get outside the building to do that. Then the next step was the intellectual property, because with standards, it's all about the IP. And what we needed to do is lay down a foundation to clarify the intellectual property that's related to this, so that we had something to contribute to the market and open market as an open standard and free open source. So we had to have a clear chain of title, if you will, on the intellectual property. So that means a lot of time with lawyers and going through patent documentation, things like that. So then once we had these in place, we started to look at formalizing the working group. And to that end, we knew that there's a lot of great ideas and a lot of thought leadership that's out in the market. So we went out and we talked with as many of the types of people, not just in the application space where Strata has a lot of our focus, but we looked through the stack and said, look, if we can make policy orchestration work at the application, at the platform, at the data, and at the network level, then its applicability is going to be exponentially more valuable. So what we did is we talked to technology providers and standards organizations like the Metro Ethernet Forum and others to say, look, join with us. Let's do this together. We don't want this to be a proprietary product of any one company, but let's really put our best thinking together and create this working group. So we did that. And then we looked for an organization to contribute this to. And we're really looking to reach these cloud native, the future. Where is the market going? And we really believe that the organizations that are out there, that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, made a lot of sense for organizations like Strata who are really building into the future. And we said, look, let's work backwards from that to make sure that we've got the right strategy so that when we finish this, that we can reach the most people that are relevant for us. And that was really how we got the motion in place. And then day to day, I think maybe I'll turn it to Jerry to talk a little bit more about how we took that and brought us to where we are today.
Sure thing, Eric. Yeah, because we were, as part of this process, we were doing really two things. As I mentioned in the slide opening, there's IDQL, which is maybe more like a traditional spec like SAML, so there's defining the specification. but we were also building this open source implementation. So we treated that like we were building a product. And so we used an agile process where we went through a lot of research and brainstorming at first to further, flesh out those initial concepts and ideas. And then we started doing, deeper research and just a lot of prototyping. And I think, Mike, you'll talk more about this later. But we just iterated through that process. Focused on one platform at a time, saw what worked, what didn't, and just kept moving forward and iterating over and over again to finally get to working code, and then add additional platforms as we went along. So that was really treating it like building a product, and then putting it out into GitHub as an open source repository. Mm-hmm. And along the way, as we're building the product, then also working to provide or collect and construct all the material that we needed for the submission to CNCF. So that was, that's been really an interesting phase of this project, that was sort of hidden from public, over the last, 6 to 8 months or so. And now we're so happy to bring it to light.
That's awesome. And as we think about this, there was mention again of the east-west sort of axis as we think about that cross-platform, cross-cloud platform consistency and policy. But I was also mentioned in the north-south. Neil, you were an early member of the working group from the Versa side. What can you tell us a little bit about what it means to have consistent policy up and down the tech stack?
Well, just as we were describing that, you have all these clouds that have the different policy, and the customers have to worry about, doing policy in one cloud and then doing policy in the other cloud, and working with all of that checks and balances in order just to make it consistent, right? That was becoming a problem, right? From on-premise to the cloud, the same set, but that's just in one layer, right? A lot of the same type of stuff that you want to do at the host level or the platform level, and then at the network level and at the data level, those are a lot of the same type of information needs to be shared in order to do that, right? If we're going to do zero trust at the network edge, then I need to make sure that everybody connecting actually is authenticated and authorized. Well, the same type of information that I'm using in that policy is a lot of the same information that's being used at the application layer to identify and authenticate that the user actually has access to that application and is authorized to do the individual commands that they want to do in the application. And what we were seeing is a lot of people were saying, yeah, so I've got this funny thing over here that I'm doing in the application layer, and then I got this funny thing that I'm doing over here in the network layer, and they're not the same. And now it's just that cloud issue over again, where it's I've got to define it all over here, I got to define it all over here, and I got to keep it a consistent experience from the user perspective, right? Because you don't want to have one decision being made at network level that's contrary to being what's made at the application layer. All right, you need that consistent set. And people are saying, I need one model. I need one way of putting my policy in that says, I need Neil to access X. And that has to permeate through all the layers of the OSI model, right? If I want to do it at 5 different points, I need that consistency. And that's why Versa really got on board in this, because this is where we see this going is, you want to give that single pane of policy glass, if you will, to the customer. And if they want to do it at the application layer, or if they want to do it at the network layer, let them do it and let them reuse that definition as they see fit through a common language.
Awesome. Well, as I was thinking through some of the research, several of you have mentioned on that. Eric, you'd actually touched on the customer research, but there was also, from an audience perspective, wasn't there an application developer research that we were doing as well, as trying to understand what did this mean to app developers? What were the challenges? And as we think about that, and Mike, the contributions, both as someone who's worked on creating hundreds of apps yourself, but also in helping us bring Hexa to light, the open source software. Any thoughts on the perspective there? What were the challenges for app developers?
Yeah, I think maybe it helps a little bit of my background to talk about. So I was at a company, Pivotal Labs, for more than a decade, and we truly built hundreds of apps for startups, enterprises, and it was interesting along the way. the beginning of a new app that we might create, there was this moment where we had a few weeks where we had to think about things like single sign-on, or OAuth, or SAML. And it was interesting, over the years, we've put a lot of code, right, kind of deep into the applications that we built, specifically, around who's able to do what and that decision. And I think for me, from the app side, being able to pull that outside, both the decision as well as then orchestrating policy around who could do what, it's really amazing. So every time I fire up a suite of Spring Boot apps, for example, and I could go into the Hexa admin that we've baked into the open source, and I could change access for Jerry across that whole suite of apps, it's still kind of, makes me laugh a little bit, like, oh my gosh, we're really, onto something here. So yeah, from day one, probably sitting on a chairlift with Eric, have been super excited to have the opportunity to work on this. So, thanks to the Strata crew for sure. And with respect to maybe the open source, I think I had for a while been wanting to dive a bit more into the open source side of things, and especially, getting into IDQL, right, the language itself, thinking about that side of the house. Maybe an interesting thing for me putting all this together, there was a lot of heavy research, and coming from a Pivotal Labs background, right, where we're heavy on the execution side, right? That was fairly interesting for me. So I was wearing both, dev hat as a bit and a bit of a TPM hat at the time. And I think one thing I learned is, not be fearful to throw things away. So there were a lot of attempts, kind of version 1, version 2 of kind of a reference architecture implementation that, we threw out, we replaced as we learned along the way. And I think the code base that you're looking at now in the open source might be the 3rd or 4th rev of that research. And I think we landed on a really good place, in a really good place. I also think just the ruthless refactoring is interesting, and maybe how we talk about stories and, how things get interpreted, by the community has been an interesting thing for me as well. So yeah, that's a little bit on the dev side. And I guess I'm looking forward to, as Mark mentioned at the beginning, a continuation, a deep dive on the tech side and a follow-up webinar potentially.
Absolutely. Yeah, we realized in doing the rehearsal for this that we had so much good stuff that we wanted to talk about that we weren't going to have as much time to actually work with the software. So in the follow-up email for everybody in the audience, we want to let you know we'll be scheduling a developer workshop to really get into all of this and go into the demos. And we want to encourage everybody to work with Hexa and bring those questions to us so that we can beat it up and hear the stories and hear the experience. And Neil, back to you as we're thinking about that, the network and the application layer, thoughts on, from a app developer perspective or the network layer.
So from the network layer, one of the things that Versa's always prided itself on is trying to do everything as much as we can standards based, right? I think Bob said it perfectly. There were proprietary solutions that you could do that would sort of build these connectors and solve this for you, but you got locked into that, right? And at the network, one of the things you talk about is just the TAC-X Plus and all that type of stuff that you could do at the network layer that didn't necessarily translate to the application layer, right? They had their way of solving it, and it gave you a lot of the context, and you could build a lot of that policy. The problem was it was only for the network layer. I couldn't go into it. And as a network company that's doing, software-defined wide area network and software-defined security, we needed to be able to go to the level of, doing layer 7, right? Really understanding the applications. So now we needed a way of bridging that gap. And what we've learned is anytime that we can do this in a standards-based method, it drives a better adoption for our company and for the customers, because it gives the customer a sense of that, this has been looked at. It's been tried and true. The community has validated it. And then what they're doing here, like in the say they use Versa, what they're doing with Versa is not just thrown away when they decide, hey, Versa is no longer the company I want to use. I want to go and use it for someone else. They haven't lost all of that development work, right? It is now reusable. And I know that there's a lot of companies out there who don't necessarily like that kind of interop. But from my experience, driving that interop and having that capability of doing that interop actually drives your customer sales higher, because now your customer knows that you're willing and able to do a lot of things. And so I think the standard of how to define the policy now, how to use authentication, how to use authorization, how to use context, and putting that all together and being able to do this in a common language across the whole stack is what's going to drive this. And so now you can see how a networking company would use it and allow their customers to go all the way down to the application stack. So what they're defining for the network is not disparate from what they find at the application layer, right? And so then it permeates all of the environments. And I think that's what we learned. And so when we started to talk about the East-West, then we also talked about the North-South, right? Because a lot of companies have different business units, and they have different things within the business unit. So it's not just East-West in the in the clouds, but it's also East-West within the company, right? And you have to talk about that, and you have to be put onto the right segment. So
I think an early thing we heard as well in talking with you and others, there's actually like a skills gap too that brought this about, in terms of, as we're thinking about from an HR perspective, like who's that unicorn developer who's a polyglot in all of these languages and syntaxes, and they know who they are and they know their worth, and they're incredibly expensive and they're few and far between. And there's this aspect of like, what if you didn't have to worry about that as well? You had this
exactly. It gives a place for the people to pull the stuff from. It's a positive. It's almost like a lean NFV type of deployment, where you put the stuff there and then you use it appropriately. So that it fits very nicely into that.
Absolutely. Well, and as we think about the standards, I actually do want to get back to just a little bit of what we maybe have learned, from past experience. I wasn't actually involved in the early SAML days, but we're lucky enough to have a few people who were. Eric and Bob, as you think about, what were some of the lessons in creating SAML that you knew that we needed to do differently with IDQL and Hexa?
Well, I'll start by saying, SAML was in many ways a remarkable achievement. But what we achieved was a specification, not an implementation, right? And so after we reached consensus on the specification, we went to the providers of IDPs, right, identity providers, and worked with them to implement the SAML spec and to test their implementations to see if they actually interoperated in the wild. So that's a little bit like having two space programs independently build modules for space, and then setting them up there, and then having both sides kind of go out with their toolboxes on a spacewalk and modify the airlocks in real time to allow them to dock, right? It's not a super efficient mechanism for achieving interoperability. And I think what the IDQL team has done with Hexa is to basically build an airlock module that if you want to build a space capsule, you can incorporate into your space capsule. And it's already been tested so that two of them fit together, when you try it. And so we avoided, like 5 or 10 years worth of interops that we did in the SAML days at Catalyst and at, Digital ID World and other forums, to get things to work together after the fact, according to the specification, by providing a reference implementation, which in principle had to interoperate because it was a single implementation. So I think that was a big lesson learned.
Yeah, absolutely. And to build on that, I think a couple things that we also saw was the importance of keeping things simple. Because if you have too much of a scope, you can't build anything. And so we really looked at being very ruthless in scoping this down. And it was a constant conversation about how do we make this practically implementable. And so one way that we did that was by, looking at the systems that we were looking to orchestrate policies within and work backwards and say, for instance, can we do this repeatably, reliably through an API? And if we couldn't, then it was out of scope. So we really set our guardrails around things that we could practically implement using APIs, using existing policy syntax and structures. And what came out of that was a lowest common denominator, which was something that we could actually implement. And we learned a whole lot in the process of doing the implementation. And I think Mike alluded to that was, a lot of this refactoring, saying, okay, well, we got it to work with 2 out of 3 systems, but when we do the 3rd system, it changed our assumptions. So we need to go back, refactor for systems 1 and 2 and 3. Now they all work together. And that was a iterative process. And by doing that in a implementation of Hexa, we were able to do that very quickly. And, sure, we had multiple constituents from different organizations working on that project. We were still very focused on who had their hand on the keyboard so that we could have that speed and the velocity. So I thought that was really helpful. And then, I think the idea of saying, look, we don't need to wait for clouds to adopt this. We can jumpstart that adoptions by giving away the Hexa implementation, because that's, as Bob describes it, as an airlock that you can use with like preset Lego configuration. That was really the idea, is to get the core foundation for the main clouds and a reference implementation through the north-south of the stack, so that anyone who's coming in here isn't starting from scratch. And if you're, for instance, looking to build a connector for another cloud to do application level work, well, you've got a source code you can look at, and you could build derivative components very quickly. If you want to do it on the network, you can also, start from a jogging or running start. So it was really kind of seeing how do we jumpstart adoption by pre-building as much of this as we could on as small a scope as we could.
The visual metaphors in this session are awesome. I love the airlock, the jumpstart, the run. Jerry, did you have something on that as well?
Yeah, I think what Eric and Bob described here is a way to get to adoption much faster. Because when you think about, the lead time from going from, SAML spec defined to, the network effect of having enough identity providers and relying parties using that spec, that was 10 years or longer. So it was really quite a lead time, because we had to go through the product management backlog for all of those companies and vendors, right, to get the spec into the backlog and actually get it implemented, and then make it interoperable along the way. So what we've done here is taken from that experience, and like Eric said, using the available public APIs of these platforms, we can bring the standard to those platforms. We don't have to wait for the product owners within the cloud platforms to adopt IDQL. We can bring it to them with Hexa. So that's a huge game changer for this effort compared to other standards efforts.
Absolutely. And that actually got me thinking about adoption from the business practitioner perspective, and very much was thinking about, okay, so we've talked about where this has value inside of the business or the enterprise, the value that this has to an app developer. But as we think about like that business, the core business value, and we look at where this has real impact and reach. Tom, in your experience, you've led identity and security organizations for some of the world's biggest financial services orgs. Are there any examples or things that you've thought about as you've been working with us on the working group for this project?
Yeah, first let me just say, I love being here today, because this is, as you guys know, I've been talking about multi-cloud and challenges now for a long time, having lived through a lot of that. And it's just great to see it all kind of come to fruition, with IDQL and Hexa being born. I think when we look back in the industry as a whole, the days of, a single cloud provider are kind of gone, right? People are now thinking multi-cloud, and multi-cloud has a bunch of different meanings to it, right? It may also include private cloud, on-prem endpoints, legacy stuff that you might have in your environment. As you guys have talked about already on the panel, I think when you look at just the 3 CSPs, the big ones, right, across the 3 of them, over 40,000 permissions, right, between groups, roles, and policies that need to be set. And each of them have their own unique identity management system. And that was by design, going back into, the original birth of them, thinking that, hey, whoever comes to us, we want to have our own proprietary format. Well, in reality, in practice, within business initiatives and in CIOs and technology organization, this is a nightmare, right? Like trying to manage multiple different CSPs, which essentially is, as you guys know, my favorite analogy, the apples, oranges, and bananas, right? And we've got problems today in each of these cloud environments with over-permissioned services or identities that are running there. And why is that? Well, because people don't understand, developers don't understand how these proprietary systems work. So they tend to gravitate towards over-permissioning them instead of really trying to understand how to operate effectively. Well, if you break that down and you say, well, how would we solve that prior to Hexa and prior to IDQL? Well, it really comes into now, I have to have multiple teams supporting these individual cloud environments, right? I have to go out and get AWS developers, I got to get Google developers, and so forth. And the reasons for why a business is doing that are many-fold, right? You might have a marketing department that loves Google because of its analytical capability, whereas your IT department loves AWS because of its ability to grant permissions at the finest grain resources. But the problem here also becomes when you start thinking about your pipelines into the cloud, and you might want to use it for other reasons, maybe BCP reasons, or to even make sure you can have the ability to fall back. For instance, I'll give you an example. In one of my prior roles, we were a big Microsoft shop, and they had a small outage at a time that didn't really affect us, right? But suddenly got the CTO and CIO thinking about, hey, Tom, what would we do if that was down for any extended period of time? Like, how would we really manage that? And so we started thinking about, how would we solve this? Well, we're going to need to bring in, another set of developers now to start thinking about decomposing our applications and bringing in those groups, roles, and policies of that other cloud provider so that we can start to bake them into our pipelines and be able to deploy them simultaneously. That's a tremendous challenge, right? In terms of being able to understand how am I setting permissions, at a baseline level across each of these. So, what I'm really encouraged about and excited, and I'd love to be a part of it now for the last couple of years, we are introducing a way where, one, organizations who don't even know what policies they have running in these environments, through policy discovery, you can pull them down. Two, transformation, right? Bringing it back into, a common IDQL declarative language. You can manage it centrally in one place. This is huge, right? I don't need to have individual multiple teams out there. I don't need to have quality control around how are my pipelines being moved into the different cloud systems. And oh, by the way, while they're running, I have to monitor to make sure their permissioning is level set. I don't need to do that anymore if I can do it in a centralized place, right? And be able to then translate it back to an apple, orange, or banana through orchestration, right? And so I'm tremendously excited. I think this has a great place in the industry, and being an identity fan my whole career, it's just exciting to see something like this come to the market. So couldn't be happy. Couldn't be happier. So
Awesome. No, I appreciate that. And I think Eric, you touched on it a little bit, was how easy the being able to take a running start. This isn't something where people like, is this going to be a really onerous effort for people to implement in their own applications or in their own businesses? Is it worth the effort? But it sounds like it's actually quite easy to get up and going. As maybe you or Bob has thoughts about this, with legacy systems and interoperability.
Yeah, well, from my standpoint, I think the interoperability, we've been starting with the forward look and saying, look, we can at some point look more at the legacy, but let's not build something for yesterday. Let's build it for the future. And so a lot of the initial use cases and target platforms are all of these cloud native systems. And I think we've got a fair amount of scope ahead of us to really make all of that work and develop the ecosystem as well. I'm sure as my own day-to-day experience in the Strata and the Mavericks universe around identity orchestration has shown is that there's a need in the market to have a foot in the future and a foot in the present, and some aspect of the shadow of the past continues forward, and that I think really creates an opportunity to say, look, we don't have to abandon everything we've done in the past. Now we have a way to take IDQL and Hexa and have connectors built for legacy systems. And the way that we've structured this is to really invite the community to do this. So that imagine if you're a developer and your project is app modernization, and as a result, you've got to work with 3 of the CSPs, but also the on-prem, the legacy work. Well, the same principles will apply when you point the Hexa at the APIs of software built 5, 10, even 20 years ago. And so that's the hope, is that we can spread this around so that people, they're not out on an island doing one-off work that they don't want to maintain and deal with, but instead, imagine being able to have a community that you can build a connector. You think it's maybe a one-off, but there's someone else in the ecosystem that says, I had that same target system I had to work with. Let me work on a connector with you. And hopefully we use the open source community as a way to create and foster collaboration so that we can build a generic connector for a common legacy system that will solve a whole lot of people's problems. So while the focus is on the future, the applicability is for the present and the past as well.
Gotcha.
So I guess I would follow up on that by saying, referring back to something that Eric said earlier. I think there was a lot of emphasis in IDQL, as there was in SAML. We did this very intentionally in the SAML days, on minimality, right? And so solving multi-cloud identity management is already a relatively big problem, and you want to keep the solution to the sort of simplest feasible solution for at least version 1 of the standard. Solving multi-cloud plus all of the legacy on-premises identity administration issues is a much bigger problem, and it would have cut against the minimality goal to try to bundle all of that into the spec. And I think that it's also important to understand that there are 2 types of activities here, right? So multi-cloud identity management is a coexistence and interoperability task primarily, because people don't think that they're going to migrate from Azure to AWS or vice versa. They think they're going to use all of those platforms in parallel going forward. And so the capability to administer them at the same time has to exist, maybe not in perpetuity, but for the foreseeable future, right? On the other hand, moving from an on-premises identity infrastructure to a cloud identity infrastructure is, at least in principle, a migration exercise, not a coexistence exercise. Obviously, there will be a long period of time in some enterprises where these things will exist side by side, but nobody wants to keep the legacy on-premises stuff forever, right? They want eventually to migrate that into the cloud. So it may be that what you have, that in an ideal world, you would essentially do an ETL from on-premises stuff to IDQL in order to get into the future environment. And you wouldn't really want to build into the Hexa implementation an ability to administer everything in the legacy environment, because that would just be dragging the anchor through the muck on the bottom of the ocean, and slowing you down in getting to the future. Now, in practical terms, in big enterprises, you are going to have that legacy coexistence for a while, but it would be nice to hope that the migration eventually concludes and that you don't have to spend a lot of time maintaining vestigial organs in the Hexa code base for systems that hopefully will cease to exist at some point.
Yeah, that's a good point about the scope. We always were trying to refine the scope and stand back from the scope creep that seems to infect every project. But I think we instilled a lot of discipline around that. But Mark, you were asking a moment ago about how to get started, and certainly people can go to the Hexa repo today. We have a mantra here at Strata about being able to do something in 10 minutes or less. So that was definitely the bar we were looking to, get code in someone's hands and get them a workable experience that quickly. And so Mike and team really did a fantastic job in being able to set up a fully contained local environment where you can have, a running Hexa policy administration component and a target sample application to work with. So it's really belies the complexity behind what we've done so far, that you could actually download, build it, and install it that quickly, sometimes even in 5 minutes or less.
It sure beats that 10 or 15 year wait that we saw with some of the earlier experiences. I mean, that's and the open source aspect of this allows, Eric, as you mentioned, the intent is to allow others to build on top of it. The core functionality was built for today and tomorrow, but should somebody want to do that, there's absolutely every opportunity to build those connectors with what's been open source. So, I guess at this point, just any last closing thoughts? I didn't know if there was, we covered a lot of topics. Obviously we were looking at why did we create IDQL and Hexa? We looked at some of the challenges that presented themselves, and we weren't just bored, right? This wasn't, we had empty cycles and we're like, what can we go do? And let's just create a new identity standard. There was actually very demonstrated need from a broad audience needing this. As we think to, any closing thoughts as we want to share with the audience? We have people joining us who are identity practitioners, app developers, from other standards. Any closing thoughts that folks might have? And I'm just sort of open flooring it for the last few minutes here. Eric, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I'm not putting you on the spot.
No problem. I do have a thought I'd like to share with the audience, which is please get involved. We did this not with an intention to do anything other than create this interoperability to free you from a lot of the proprietary lock-in and so forth, right? So the intent here is to really foster openness and agility and all of these other aspects. And we made this investment in a standard and the open source to really facilitate that. And we would love all the great input that we've gotten from Neil, from Bob, from Mike, from Tom, and many others that are not on the panel today. But great ideas become stronger with more contribution. And I think really to communicate our expectation is let's make this a thing for all of us, not any one of us. And so getting involved with the working group, it's a very active process. Jerry is very diligent in running it day to day. And we're really excited about now bringing this to the public so that we can get more people on board. And we really hope that you do. And we're happy to help facilitate ramping up and maybe, doing more content as we will shortly in the future for a deep dive with the developers. But we really want to do this for the community and are asking for everybody to get involved if you could. That'd be great.
Terrific. Anybody else? Any closing thoughts? I know that we had a lot of range of topics. Are there any other thoughts that anybody might have for the audience?
Yeah, I think you're on mute.
Oh, Tom.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Sorry, it's double click problem. So no, I think Eric summed it up really, really well. And I think hopefully the audience out there, this is resonating with many of you in terms of the need. We definitely also need you to participate, right? Become part of that working group. I think that from a business technology standpoint, I know a lot of you are out there right now are going through transformations in your own organization, much to what Bob and Eric and others, summed up today around some of that legacy stuff that might be in need of modernization. And you're trying to figure out, how do I effectively move this, not just to a primary cloud provider, but to have the ability to move to multiple cloud providers simultaneously, or cross stack, or geography, whatever the reason might be. Please take a look at this, because I think it's a good place for you to ground yourselves on in terms of the architecture, and also from a cost perspective, risk perspective, deployment perspective. The benefits to the business and the IT organization are enormous, right? Not to mention it's going to drive down, your costs across many different aspects. So.
For sure.
So I guess I'll say something maybe a little broader than the conversation we're having here today, which is, those of you listening, if you may be thinking, well, okay, IDQL sounds a little bit like the multi-cloud SAML. And if that's the case, where is the multi-cloud XACML? And where is the multi-cloud audit logging and log search API? And, do we need those things too? And the answer is yes, of course we do, right? Because multi-cloud environments are going to have to be administered according to every piece of functionality that they offer. And so, I guess my advice is, if you feel the need for some of those things because the lack of them is getting in the way of a job that you're trying to do in a multi-cloud environment, maybe if you look to your left and look to your right and don't see anybody doing it, you're the guy or you're the gal, right? So you can certainly make use of people who have been in activities like this before, and get in touch with the people on the call for advice on how these systems work. But I expect that there is that there are more multi-cloud administration APIs that are going to come down the pike. And if you see the lack of one, it would be a welcome service to the community if you were to maybe start up an effort to provide it.
And I'd like to call out to everybody, even the managed service providers and the service providers themselves, right? This whole spec is not just solving an enterprise's set. It's solving even a service provider set, where you have to do this integration. Your customers are coming to you and asking you to build very complex systems, and you're trying to figure out how to do a standard policy definition across that whole complex set. This is exactly what you need is this common language. And the Metro Ethernet Forum is behind this because they see that this is a need in that service provider space to actually deal with identity management across many different platforms, whether it's on-premise legacy or whether it's in the future cloud models. We need something here that'll allow the end user to create these policies in a standard way, such that when the CISO says, "Hey, are we covered?" he's not saying, "Hey, are we covered here? Are we covered there? Are we covered?" No, are we covered? Yes, I went to the standard thing, and the standard policy is applied at all the different endpoints.
Well, excuse me, losing my voice there. Well, with that, I think we are just at time. Jerry, would you share some thoughts about what's next and where are we headed to now that so that the spec and the open source software has been available since earlier this year on GitHub? There was a big announcement this past week. Many news organizations picked up the story because there's a lot of interest here. What's next for IDQL and Hexa?
Yeah, well, I guess the next big milestone, Mark, is waiting on approval from CNCF to be a formal Sandbox project. So, the next meeting is happening next month, and we're certainly looking forward to that. But meanwhile, since the announcement, we've had quite a tremendous response from people wanting to get involved. People from vendors, from systems integrators, from enterprise organizations. So my calendar is filling up to talk to those folks about how to get involved. And as Eric just mentioned, we really are looking to broaden the participation here so we can get more perspectives, get more use cases and requirements. So, please do reach out. There's contact information here. You can see the GitHub repo as well. So there's two actual repositories, one for IDQL, it's called Policy, and one for Hexa, that's called Policy Orchestration. So you can go out and take a look at what we've been up to. And there again, you can contribute issues, you can contribute code, make a pull request, and so on. There's an explanation of how to get involved there on the GitHub repo as well. We've also touched on this developer workshop that we are thinking about hosting in the very near future. So Mike can give us a deeper tour into the code itself, go through some examples, run through the demo where I do feel like a unicorn, Mark, where I can manage policies in these different environments. And I don't know how to do that natively. So it's really an amazing feeling running through those demonstrations. And then even beyond what's that, sorry?
It's a little bit of a superpower. It's kind of fun. Yes, the unicorn ability that this gives you. Yes.
Absolutely. And then even further down the road, we're talking with the MEF about setting up an incubation project sometime later this year so we can get to work on what Neil was describing. How do we tie this IDQL and Hexa to the SASE world and all the great standards around zero trust that MEF is building. So lots of different exciting activities here going forward. So please do join us and jump into the ring with us.
Well, I thank you everybody for joining us. I wasn't kidding when we said we had a full hour of content, but hopefully we answered those questions that we set out to do at the beginning, where people were really interested in why did we do this? What were the challenges? How does this complement existing standards that are out there today? Where does this fit in the identity ecosystem? And how do we get involved? And so I just want to do a quick thank you to everybody for taking your time to join us today, our speakers, but also our audience. I know this was a valuable hour of time. Hopefully you all found it really interesting as I did. We'll be sharing a recording of this session via email afterward, along with responses. And be sure to also check your inbox for invitations to the developer workshop. We'd love to get our hands dirty and really start playing with this together. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone and wish you all a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.